theory is important, and it's important to know what you believe. In other words, what the basis of all other possible theory is. I'm a feminist. I'm a Lacanian. I'm a student of Paul de Man. I believe that these are the foundational moments of theorizing, and that if you're going to teach anything like a survey, you've got to derive the rest of it from whatever the moment I happen to subscribe to might be. Right? That's the way it felt to teach theory in those days. It was awkward teaching an introduction, and probably for that reason, while I was teaching Lit 300, which was called Lit Y, Paul de Man was teaching Lit Z. He was teaching a lecture course nearby, not at the same time, which was interpretation as practiced by the school of de Man. That was Lit Z. And it did indeed imply every other form of theory, and it was extremely rigorous and interesting, but it wasn't a survey. It took for granted, in other words, that everything else would derive from the fundamental idea, but it didn't for a minute think that a whole series of fundamental ideas could share space, could be a kind of smorgasbord that you could mix and match in a kind of happy-go-lucky eclectic way, which perhaps we will be seeming to do from time to time in our introductory course. Well, now, does one feel any nostalgia for the coolness and heat of this moment? Yes and no. It was fascinating to be, as Wordsworth says, bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. It was fascinating to be around in those days. But at the same time, I think it's rather advantageous for us to be still in theory. That is to say, we still have views. We still have to recognize that what we think derives from this or that understanding of theory and these or those theoretical principles. And we have to understand the way in which what we do and say, what we write in our papers and articles, is grounded in theoretical premises, which, if we don't come to terms with them, we will simply naively reproduce without being fully aware of how we're using them and how indeed they're using us. And so it is as crucial as ever to understand theory. At the same time, we have the vantage point of, I suppose, what we can now call history. Some of what we'll be studying is no longer practiced as that which is the absolutely necessary central path to methodology. Some of what we're studying has had its moment of flourishing, has remained influential as a paradigm that shapes other paradigms, but is not itself perhaps today the paradigm, which gives us the opportunity of historical perspective, so that from time to time during the course of the course, I'll be trying to say something about why certain theoretical issues and ideas pushed themselves into prominence at certain historical moments. And that too then can become part of our enterprise. So an introduction is not only valuable for those of us who simply wish to acquire knowledge, it's also valuable, I think, in lending an additional perspective to the topic of theory and to an understanding about how theory is, on the one hand, perhaps in a certain sense now, an historical topic, and is, on the other hand, something that we're very much engaged in and still committed to. So all that then by way of rationale for teaching an introduction to theory. All right, now the question, how does the history of, how does literary theory relate to the history of criticism? Now, this is a course that I like to teach too. Usually teach it Plato to T.S. Eliot, or Plato to I.A. Richards, or some sort of important figure in the early 20th century. And it's a course which is absolutely fascinating in all sorts of ways. And it has one very important thing in common with literary theory. That is to say, literary criticism is, too, perpetually concerned with the definition of literature. Many of the issues that I raised in talking about defining literature are as relevant for literary criticism as they are for literary theory. And yet we all instinctively know that these are two very different enterprises. Literary theory loses something that literary criticism just takes for granted. Literary theory is not concerned with issues of evaluation, and it's not really concerned with concomitant issues of appreciation. Literary theory just takes those for granted as part of the sense experience, as one might say, of any reader, and prefers rather to dwell on questions of description, analysis, and speculation, as I've said. Now that's what's lost in theory. But what's new in theory? And here I come to the topic which will occupy most of my attention for the remainder of the lecture. What's new in theory is the element of skepticism that literary criticism, by and large, which is usually affirming a canon of some sort, doesn't reflect. Literary theory, as I say, is skeptical about the foundations of its subject matter and also, in many cases, about the foundations of what it itself is doing. So the question is, how on earth did this come about? It's an historical question, as I say, and I want to devote the rest of the lecture to it. Why should doubt about the veridical or truth-affirming possibilities of interpretation be so widespread in the 20th century? Now, here, a big glop of intellectual history. I think it arises from what one might call, and what often is called, modernity, not to be confused with modernism, an early 20th century phenomenon, but the history of modern thought as it usually derives from the generation of Descartes, Shakespeare, Cervantes. Notice something about all of those figures. Shakespeare is preoccupied with figures who may or